Emmerdale that hasn't aired on ITV1 yet, but can be viewed on ITVX. Rona Goskirk, Zoe Henry, thought she would try to get through to evil Celia Daniels, Jay Griffiths, in Friday's Emmerdale episode, but her intervention backfired spectacularly. It did, however, give us a bit of an insight into Celia's early life that hinted at tragedy in her past. Since April Windsor, Amelia Flanagan, revealed to her family that she'd been caught up in Celia and Ray, Joe Absalom's drug-dealing operation, her parents Marlon, Mark Charnock, and Rona have desperately tried to think of ways to end the nightmare. An attempt to flee the village with the family was foiled by Ray, who menacingly told them that he had eyes and ears on them at all times. Marlon and Rona hoped that they could pay off the debt that Ray reckons April owes him. The sum of £20,000. They scraped the money together with the help of a payday loan with ridiculous interest rates, but when they gave it to Ray, he took money and informed them that nothing had changed. There was better news for them when they heard that Dylan, Fred Kettle, is going to survive the injuries he got when Ray deliberately ran him over as a warning. In fact, he's doing so well that the doctors plan to wake him soon from his induced coma. This news has also found its way back to Celia. In the Woolpack in this episode, Rona saw Celia and made a desperate offer to do the drug-dealing jobs instead of April. Celia appeared to consider this for a few moments before deciding that Rona would pee her pants at the first sign of trouble. Angrily, Rona asked her how she slept at night, and Celia's answer was chilling. "I don't," she said. "And neither will April." She went on to say that everything that was happening to April had also happened to her. "I even had my own Dylan," she said, and there was perhaps a ghost of a smile at the memory before she shut it down by saying he was long gone now. Could that have been a turning point in Celia had stood in the doorway like something someone had once seen on a winter dawn? The light half caught all angles. She had been immaculate, as always, her crisp coat buttoned to the throat, a pin of a smile that wasn't warmth at all but a measuring tool. When Rona had offered to take April's place, to do the hand-to-hand, to collect the packages, to carry the fear like a purse rather than letting a 14-year-old carry it, Celia had paused. That pause had the weight of a verdict. "You'd pee your pants the first sign of trouble," Celia had said, not unkindly, and when Rona flinched, the act of watching her had the cold constancy of a pulse. Rona had asked how she slept. The answer was a blade. "I don't," Celia had said. "And neither will April." It was the line that slid in afterward, not random, not accidental, that had clung to Rona's ribs like frost. "I even had my own Dylan," Celia had said. There had been the ghost of something like tenderness in that, a scrap of memory she'd allowed herself for a breath, before it was shuttered and she became flat and hard. Long gone now. Rona carried that line home the way people carried groceries, with an eye on what might break. She and Marlon sat on the settee in a living room that smelled faintly of lavender and of denial. Dylan's prognosis until then had been a brittle kerchief of relief. Doctors would wake him, they said, and the family breathed as if the room had become that slow in when someone steps off a cliff and finds a temporary ledge. But Celia's murmured history, "my own Dylan," made no sense until it did. It set an ugly seed of possibility in Rona's mind. What if Celia's romance with cruelty had roots? What if someone had taught her being the hammer was better than being struck? What if, in the calculus of her life, pain had become a currency she had to spend to survive? The Dingles and the Winstons moved like people carrying flat glass. They kept Dylan's hospital room under surveillance. Shifts drawn up between friends, family, sympathetic neighbors, a rota as meticulous as it was desperate. One of them even offered to sleep on a hard chair by the window. Someone else would sit in the corridor like a prayer. Marlon and Rona took turns on the night shift, the fluorescent light painting their faces in a light that made the skin like paper. On the third night, while rain stitched the valley's gutters with silver thread, Rona stood by Dylan's bed and listened to the ventilator's humped breath. It was a machine rhythm, a promise and a threat at once. She watched his lashes tremble, the tiniest tremor, like someone awakening in the incomplete light between dream and waking. She thought of Celia's smile and the way it had folded back on itself. She thought of April's hands, small and quick, of how much she'd been forced to carry. At first it was subtle. A whisper of noise outside the ward, the heels of shoes hushed by deliberate steps. The hospital was a building of echoes. People came and went all the time. Rona told herself that. Marlon said he had seen nothing but the eyes of the corridor camera blink. Still, dread is an animal that smells when there's only a shadow. They had been careful. They had hired an agency lad for afternoons, asked Zara to sit for an hour each night, and even wheeled in an old friend of Marlon's, whose broad hands were meant to be a deterrent. And yet, horror has its ways of slipping through the steam of ordinary defenses. The phone call came at dawn. It was quiet at first, as if the voice itself were treading over something fragile. "It's the hospital," the voice said. "You need to come." They ran. They reached the ward to find the nurses clustered like a flock with their heads bent low. The doctor met them at the entrance, and he had the exhausted look of someone who'd seen too many improbable things and had to choose what to believe. "We did all we could," he said. "We're very sorry." Dylan had been woken that morning. For an hour he'd opened his eyes and smiled, a small, ridiculous miracle. He'd mouthed the name of his mother and asked for a drink. The family cried for reasons that had nothing to do with medical protocol. They cried because a boy they had already mourned in their minds had returned. He was dead before noon. There was a scene that replayed itself in those whose lives were left. The steel door slamming, the metallic taste in breath, the description of the corridor. A man in a dark coat, face a shadow, who had then moved with the speed of inevitability. Celia's handwriting was everywhere, even when her name was not. The police would later say it was a professional hit. Not blunt, not an accident, but a strike designed to be both message and punctuation. There were no witnesses who could place the hand, only impressions. A limp scarf, a footprint not quite matched to anything, the weight of a presence remembered by a CCTV too low to count the features. If anyone truly believed Celia had an accidental history with tragedy before, they were foolish in the way the living are foolish, always inventing the possibility of mercy. Celia's past was not an excuse. It was a textbook. She knew how to calculate the smallest human chink and where it would split. At the funeral, it rained like an orchestra tuned to grief. People who had been extras in each other's lives stood up to name their sorrow. April held herself small, a folded thing, watched over by a mother whose hands shook from the grief and from the knowledge that every plan they'd scraped together had been wooden against the storm. Marlon's heart made the speech. It was not polished. It was raw and cracked and honest. He said Dylan had a laugh that could cleave darkness. He had a way of spitting out a joke in the instant you needed it least, but wanted it most. Celia was not called by name at the graveside, though everyone knew she had been the blade that severed the thread. People used euphemisms, the man or those responsible, as if naming her might summon her ghost. But Celia did not need to be named to be present. Her presence was the absence left behind, the way a child's sneakers sat unused by the door, the way a room hummed with a life that had been habitual and then was not. Later, when the police visited the Goskirk house to piece together a chain of events, Rona asked the question that sat like a stone in her throat. "Why her?" she said, not to the constable but to the cold porcelain of the sink where she'd washed her hands until they were raw. The answer had been inside Celia's words the night in the woolpack. When she spoke of her own Dylan, she had been looking into a mirror that showed what had been done to her. She was telling Rona that she had been made, by a world that had cracked open, by men who took and kept, by an accident of youth and cruelty, into an instrument. That instrument, in the years since, had learned to play precise music. She had learned that the only survival was to make yourself the storm, and not the shore that breaks under it. But that is an explanation with no consolation. It is a map with no destination. It doesn't salve. In the days after the inquest, pity and righteous anger collided in equal measure. The village turned on itself as though the grief were contagious. Children were kept home from school for fear that the night's stories might inspire someone to act. The woolpack closed early for a week, its pool cues still curling like question marks. People left flowers at Dylan's favorite bench at the lamppost outside the hospital. They lit candles in windows as if a small light might be a rebuke. April curled into a silence, so complete the family feared it would be her own undoing. Rona sat with her like a guardian and a witness, and the two of them spun stories into the quiet to try to keep something alive. They would talk about Dylan's ridiculous nicknames, the one time he'd put his head in a hamper and pretended to be a mutant treasure, about the way he insisted on naming every dog he saw. These were the ordinary archives of a life. They were the things that made the dead real. But grief is not a single weather. It has seasons. Some moments were full of a rage that would have swallowed Celia if it had the shape or the strength. Rona wanted to hunt her down to the last alley and make sure she felt the same terror she had handed out. She wanted some geometry of justice. And then there were softer hours when the rage leaked into something else. A tight, hollow grief that made her chest feel like a room with a door locked and the key thrown away. The police pursued leads and made arrests in phases. Men were taken in for questioning, for being seen in the vicinity, for ties to people like Ray. Ray, as always, was a shadow that shifted and reformed. He was the smoke to Celia's spark, but he was not fire himself. There were rumors about deals gone sour, about loyalty that could be bought and sold. Men who once protected small drug routes now bent under the weight of bigger players. In those stories, Celia was less a monster and more a strategist, someone who had chosen her side and sharpened her edges until they gleamed. The village, though, needed a villain. It wanted a head on which to pin its fear. Celia filled that role perfectly because she did not perform the expected. She did not fall apart. She walked as if the ground were hers to own. She strode through the woolpack a week after the funeral, as if the world owed her nothing, and she owed the world nothing in return. Rona watched her from the bar as Celia placed an order, her movements clinical, her expression untroubled. Rona felt the old instinct to confront, to throw words like knives. But she knew now that words had not stopped a bullet the day Dylan had died. Confrontation was its own kind of litmus test. Needed and useless in the same breath. At night, when the house became a small island and the television murmured news that was suddenly small and unimportant, Rona dreamed. She dreamed of the moment where Celia had been a child, or of the moment a child had been taken from Celia, whichever had been the hinge. Dreams are not literal. They are impressions, mosaics of what might be and what was. In the dream, Celia carried a small hand, and then it was pulled free. The scene moved like film out of focus, then not. In the morning, Rona woke with the memory of someone lifting a small boy into a rain-slick car, an undertow of trauma that shaped a life. The story of that early loss came out later at the inquest in fragments. Celia had been young and alone in a part of life that grew meaner when no one noticed. She had loved. She had failed to protect. She had watched men take what she loved for reasons that seemed, to her, not about money but about proving an equation. If you could take someone from me, you could make me small. So she promised herself she would never again be made small. But there is a line between making yourself strong and choosing cruelty as a tool. Celia crossed it. She forged her heart into something useful. To protect herself, yes, but also to exact a balance. If she could not be the child who remained safe, then no child would be safe in the hands of those she wanted to punish. It is an ugly logic, but it is logic nonetheless. Tyrants and victims both find refuge in logic. In a public sphere, the village debated the rightness of the law and the wrongness of vengeance. There were petitions, heated meetings at the community center, tearful interviews. People argued that Celia was a product of a system that failed her, and that she was also a deliberate killer. They were both true. They are often both true. On the last night that the episode would be on ITVX before its television airing, the village gathered in ways that had nothing to do with the show and everything to do with themselves. In the quiet of the woolpack, people exchanged whispers like contraband. They wondered if there were more strikes to come, whether the man or woman who had killed Dylan had been working alone, whether it was even fair to hope for justice when justice had the long, slow bureaucracy of courts. Rona sat by the bar and thought of the phrase Celia had left her with. Always better to be the hammer than the anvil. She thought of her own hands, of the way they had once held a child and stitched their life together. She thought of the hammer and the anvil like two props in some mechanical fable. She did not want to be the hammer. She did not want to be the anvil either. She wanted desperately and uselessly for both terms to be irrelevant, for people to be able to live without the need to choose between being violent or being destroyed. In the end, the tragedy that was confirmed was not neat. There was no cinematic justice served. Celia continued to move unbowed through the days as she always had. Sometimes, in a corner of a shop behind a bus shelter, in the hush of the cemetery, Rona would catch a glimpse of her, and the sight would make her stomach drop. It was hard to know if fear, hatred, pity, or a strange, flat compassion came first. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Emmerdale Echoes.